Hello. Hi. We are the Game Brass, and we have in fact made 8 albums, and believe that you can too, with just the right knowledge and time and energy and all of that stuff.
It does take all of those things.
So yes, we're the Game Brass. We are a brass quintet. Why don't you describe who we are?
Sure. So, hi, my name is Daniel Rumberger. I am the trombonist and one of the Game Brass's co-founders. This is Thomas Kresge, who acts as a producer, arranger, mixer, doing a lot behind the scenes to keep the band organized. The core Game Brass ensemble is a classical brass quintet, so that would be 2 trumpets, a French horn, a trombone, and a tuba, in addition to Thomas, who's more of the manager role. So that's our default ensemble. In addition to that, we have collaborated with other brass musicians, other non-brass musicians, as different projects see fit. So throughout the course of this, we've been active for a little over 6 years. We started off meeting at MAGFest, and it just continued from there. So over the course of 6 years, we were able to create 8 albums, and we wanted to make this panel because throughout the process, we've learned a lot through having done this so much, and especially for people who are just starting out, or even people who are experienced, we hope that you'll be able to take away some useful information from what we have to share.
Yep. So hopefully this covers the whole process from when we think of an idea to actually getting it out there. So let's roll. Which is the first thing, is like, what are we even trying to do? So I personally, I can't speak for Danny, but I like making albums. You could just release a bunch of singles too. We have a YouTube channel where we release videos, and about a year or 2 into the band is when we first started on the first album. And I like the idea of, having a cohesive goal, which is what an album provides. It gives you a certain set of things to do and get done and move through. It's just a complete project to work towards. And but the first thing is, like, how do we even think of an idea, right? So we have this massive spreadsheet that started out of people just typing in what pieces they liked, having theming around it, and our theming so far has generally been some kind of broad concept that can fit multiple ideas. Our first album was snow-based, or Christmas, I guess. But, there's plenty of ice and snow and cold things in video games. So that gives you a wide breadth of musical choices. So it's not just all the same feel, style, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Jump in anytime.
Sure. So we tend to have the tendency, yes, to group our tracks based on common themes, such as snow. We had an album themed around space, one themed around castles, one themed around the macabre, spooky horror video game music. A lot of other groups, when they are working on albums, they get inspired by one particular game or one particular series. Then there are other people who have more of a broad concept. It's like, okay, what if we take this type of video game music, whether it's from a series or whatever, and we turn it into a different genre? How do we go about doing that? How do we go about the process? So if you go back to the previous slide, when we have ideas like this, then we tend to group them together in a spreadsheet. So this is an actual example of our spreadsheet from Brassylvania, tribute to the video game Macabre. These are actually the tracks that didn't end up making it onto the final album, but you can see that we had a lot of ideas that all fit this general theme, and then once we had way more ideas than we had the ability to know what to do with, then we were able to pick and fine-tune and hone in the tracks. Okay, these are the ones that we're most excited about, these are the ones that we most want to do, and work towards getting those together into an album.
And what helps with that like focus, because there's a lot of music out there that we like, and so the focus helps you focus on the core concept. Helps you focus on something more specific to get through it. Like when we did some of these other ones, like Brass See No Isles, was our third album, and is all like summery beach island themed tracks. Part of the thing that also, there's a secondary concept behind that, was that we wanted to collaborate with other musicians. So every track, we picked another artist to play alongside, which gives an even better sort of like focus behind how you might organize or what you might choose or cut. Even on some of these, like when you did Horns of Hyrule, which is all Zelda tracks.
Yeah, the idea for Horns of Hyrule is that we wanted to have one notable track from each mainline Zelda console game, and it's always the same number of brass performers, always 16. And with that, like, there was a temptation. We did Gerudo Valley, so with Gerudo Valley, most of the time when people think of it, they think of the really guitars, the flamenco riffs, and things like that. But I wanted to keep it relatively consistent and have an ensemble that would fit into a classical wind ensemble setting. So that is the reason for a lot of the instrument choices there. A Link to the Brass, I think, is our most concept-specific album. We took the entire A Link to the Past original soundtrack, recreated it as faithfully as possible using our instruments. We took a lot of care into having an accurate transcription, and with that, we also took a lot of care into making sure that the timings were 100% exact. And in addition to releasing it as an album, we released it as an MSU, which you can import directly into A Link to the Past randomizer and other type games, so you can play our soundtrack as you're beating Ganondorf.
Okay.
Choosing tracks.
So then more about like honing down what you're trying to do is, so it's easy to come up with a ton of track ideas and stuff like that. So to some extent, I try to whittle it down by just making sure there's a decent variety there. All sorts of ideas like including well-known tracks that are kind of popular versus I always try to make sure I have something in there that I just like and nobody else does, but that I care about. These deep cut tracks are always in there and nice to include. A big thing though is just allowing change as it goes along. My original idea for Brassylvania was to make it like super dark and actually scary, like a horror movie. But then as I started working on stuff, it became a little more lighthearted, but still within the theming to fit more ideas and stuff.
Yeah. So, piggybacking off of that, like we said before, a lot of our albums tend to be grouped around unifying themes and have music from multiple games and multiple series. But even if you're working with music that's from the same game or the same series, there are some popular tracks that you're definitely going to want to include, and then there might be some tracks that are more deep cuts, esoteric, that maybe you are the only one who is into. So it's important to sort of recognize what those are and balance it so that you're able to make the project such that you're happy with it. Really, this is a thing that we're doing for fun, so like you can, as long as you're doing something that makes you happy, then you're doing it right. But it's helpful for us to be able to have those unifying things. And then we have changed the core concept a couple times as we've been going throughout the revision process. So as Thomas mentioned, Brassylvania initially started off much darker than it ended up finishing. Part of that was actually my doing. I took a look at the track list and I'm like, hey, we need something in like a major key. So how about we add Life is Beautiful from Deadly Premonition, which is just this like goofy whistling tune. So we added that.
And then it went downhill from there.
Yeah. Brasino Isles Tropical Cruise, that's our third album. A sub-goal that we had for the third album was that each track would feature some guest external to the band, usually a guest who plays a non-brass instrument. We had done a lot of effort into reaching out to these guests, and by we I mean Thomas, because Thomas does most of the managerial stuff. But there were some guests who said that they were available and then their plans changed, or there were guests that we had wanted who were not available. So as that happened, we had to make whatever adjustments, whether it was doing a different track or having a different guest for the track in question.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's, just ideas, which might be the easiest part for some people. So now actually getting the thing done and doing it. We don't want to talk about licensing too much because we feel it was a topic that's kind of been ground down at this point at MAGFest too. But if you don't know, this is maybe useful, is that when we release music, we do have to license it because we didn't write the original pieces. And that involves... where do I start with this? So if you are legally allowed to license or cover any track that's been released in the U.S. as a soundtrack, meaning that if it's only shown up in the game or the movie and there's no official soundtrack, it's not licensable. It can be hard to know if this was the case because there's stuff that came out on a soundtrack as a bonus disc in the 90s, and there's 4 copies, but it still counts. I use a website, vgmdb.net, which is crowdsourced, so it's not perfectly accurate, but it's a pretty good place to check on this stuff. Otherwise, you can just search regular storefronts for it, like Apple Music and Spotify. If it's up there, it's nearly guaranteed to be licensable. I don't want to say 100% because we have run into issues, but more likely than not. So the idea is for every track you sell, you do have to pay a licensing fee that I think right now is 12.4 cents per track. And there's different services. One we've used a lot is called easysong.com. Then they obtain the licenses. So what that looks like is you say, I'm covering these 10 tracks. And they'll say, okay, how many are you going to sell? Let's say we're going to sell 100 CDs. And then you have to buy 100 licenses per track, which is a cost that can add up kind of quickly. 12.4 times 10 times 100 ends up being whatever it ends up being. Yeah. But that is the legal way to distribute these. But once you have those licenses, then you can sell that number of many. Now, if you're just releasing digitally and you don't want to think about this at all, Spotify and other streaming services actually are the ones responsible for paying those licensing fees, so you don't really have to think about this except to the extent of knowing if the track is licensable at all. This is only something you need to think about if you are actually releasing physical copies or going through Bandcamp where you have what are called permanent downloads, where somebody just downloads the song and has a copy for forever. There is another talk you can search for that was given last year called MAGFest, How to Create a VGM Cover Album, where they go into more details about this.
Yeah.
The thing to think about here is to make sure this is another thing that I guess whittles down our track list are these tracks we want to cover actually licensable? So
right. So if a track makes the initial brainstorming spreadsheet, sometimes we do the research to make sure that it's licensable right off the bat, but usually we just kind of let it sit there. And then as we go through the process of choosing what we want to cover and choosing how we want to organize the album, then that's when we start to seriously have to consider whether or not the track is licensable. Unfortunately, it does sort of limit creatively what you can do. And again, we have the goal of releasing albums digitally through Spotify and other services, as well as physically through Bandcamp. If your goal is just to make an album that's on YouTube, YouTube is kind of the Wild West in terms of legality and licensing. Technically, most video game covers on YouTube would require a sync license, and that's something that's not really accessible for most people. So typically on YouTube, anything goes, and people don't really have a problem. But for our purposes, we're mostly concerned with releasing a video game album that can be sold on digital services and storefronts, as well as made available via streaming services like Spotify. So let's move on.
So we have our track list. We try to whittle that down to what we actually want to cover, and some of that is automatically cut out because we can't license it.
Right.
So we legally aren't allowed to cover it. The main threshold is, does it have a soundtrack release within the U.S., if that's where you're releasing? Cannot speak for laws in other countries. All right, so where does that take us into the production process? We have this list of things we want to cover. and we want to release and stuff. So there's kind of 4 steps that are not happening in order. They're kind of happening overlapping or sometimes at the same time. We have to, of course, make the music, like arrange it. We have to record the music, and we have to mix the music before finally distributing it. And during all this time, there's an attempt to keep communicating and staying organized about some other details that we will get into. So, but the first step, still in the fun parts of actually like making stuff, is arranging. So we've picked out an ensemble, and we've thought of maybe guess if that's part of the album, and we start arranging. So like, what does that process look like? Because I know this can be a roadblock for a lot of people. It's just actually finishing their music. Process is going to be different, but for me personally, I'll try to transcribe the music or at least make a lead sheet of it usually. And then just start sketching something out across a minimal number of bars, or not bars, but staves, before arranging that out for our actual group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Thomas and I, we both mostly work in sheet music first, but we actually have very contrasting arrangement processes. I have transcribed music before, but I find that if I make a transcription, then I tend to want to needle down and refer exclusively to the transcription, which limits what I can do creatively. So oftentimes for me, the process of transcribing and arranging happen about simultaneously. I usually go right into the final score. I put down whatever instruments or whatever bass or melodic ideas that I know need to happen, and then I fill in the gaps around that while having the original soundtrack open and listening to it as needed for a harmony or for a counter melody or a different melodic line. And I should also say, when it comes to the arranging process, that for a lot of what we do in the game brass, it does rely pretty heavily on sheet music and getting parts communicated to people, but that the process differs depending on your idiom and depending on what you feel comfortable with as a person. A lot of people who I know who operate more as like a producer, they tend to just go right into the digital audio workstation and work that way. Other people who I know play fretted instruments or are comfortable just like recording, they don't even have an arrangement process at all. They just lay down a few tracks and then organize once they have some riffs or melodic ideas that they can use as a source material.
Yeah. Another thing about this is getting the music you're working on like done, and regardless of the process, I think of what helps me in getting through these albums is also treating them as a project that has a deadline. So when it comes to like arranging, for example, I will often think, okay, or it's easy for it to just kind of be like, I'll release it one day, I guess. There's no other person looking over me. I mean, I manage the band, so there is me to tell people to get stuff turned in. But if I'm the person who has to turn something in,
you hold yourself accountable.
Then
too.
I need to have my own deadline, and that might be like we have weekly meetings, and for me it might be, okay, I want to share this at the meeting, so I need to actually get it done by then. That just sometimes means finishing something, not worrying about every detail, but just like getting an end point on there, and then maybe I can edit it later, or maybe not. But I think we've made 8 albums by virtue of not always having to be perfect on everything.
Done is better than perfect.
Arranging 16 tracks within a couple months is a bit of a task, and so I will get to pieces where I'm just like, actually, I think we talked about this on the next one. Yes. Yeah. Okay, the next slide does get into this. So, personally, I think both Danny and I are similar on this in that we do like to have a creative interpretation on the music. Covers can range from how faithful they are to the original. Mm-hmm. But as I'm going through tracks, I will get to one and I'm like, okay, this is kind of a pretty close copy of the original just on brass instruments, and that's fine. I've got the track done and I can go on to the next one. Usually I think your creative juices will continue to flow as long as you're writing something down rather than trying to edit and write at the same time. And having the whole album, I think, has helped me personally just get through a bunch of music more regularly because there's that goal of having a bunch of stuff. Not all 11 to 16 tracks have to be a masterwork.
Yeah, and this is a slide that I feel pretty passionate about because the considerations for your arrangement depend on heavily what your goal is for the overall purpose of the album. So a reason that we like albums is because they do tend to have that sort of focus, that sort of mission that's accomplished. So the question of do you stick closely to the source material or be more interpretive? A lot of music that the Game Brass does, we do want to be more interpretive. We want to have music that could fit inside a concert hall that is not out of place among like wind ensemble pieces, things like that. But we have exceptions to that. Like A Link to the Brass, the goal was to be specifically as accurate as possible. So for that, our process ended up looking completely different. We took an actual like sound file from the game and studied that when making the arrangement. Brasino Isles is another one. We knew we were working with a lot of guests, so we didn't want to throw the guests this kind of like off-the-wall idea, so we stuck more close to the source material with that. You kind of depend... Your answers to these questions largely depends on what your goal is for the project. If you're trying to take like music and then put it into a new style or a new genre, then you have to make considerations. Okay, what are the defining things about this genre? What are the things that the original soundtrack does that are different? Is it a melody that you might have interest in changing? Is it harmonies that maybe don't really fit into jazz? What kind of concessions are you able to make such that the arrangement that you make will sound like what you want it to sound like? And a lot of that too also has to do with doing research in the genre. So if you want to have an album that sounds like Chick Corea, okay, great. Why don't you listen to a lot of Chick Corea's music, try to figure out what Chick Corea is doing harmonically, try to think of the sorts of improv solos that Chick Corea takes. How can you take those ideas and then use your arrangements to get the same sort of effects? So other considerations that we've listed on this slide: difficulty. The Game Brass mostly operates as a studio ensemble. We're based all over the US and one person in Canada. So as a result, we don't tend to consider live performance as much. But if you do consider live performance, then there are certain concessions that you can get away in a studio that are harder to get away with live, such as mute changes are a very big one. If you're just recording studio, a mute change is you turn off the recording, you put the mute on, you turn on the recording again. If you are playing live, then I've had plenty of experiences with barely possible or actually impossible mute changes. Not exactly an easy thing to do. Difficulty-wise, there are some things that I can play once and get it perfect, and it'll take me like maybe 30, 40, 50 takes, and eventually I'll get that perfect recording and it'll be good. That doesn't mean I would be able to get it perfect every single time, so if we were to do that live, oh my gosh. So definitely something to consider when you're making the studio album. One thing that we did, the Game Brass got to play on main stage last year, and we actually had to look through a lot of our arrangements and create somewhat simplified versions that were more easily playable for the live ensemble. And then other things to think about: narrative arc. So a lot of video game music loops. It just continues on from one thing to the next, but you don't necessarily want your arrangement to loop. Is there going to be a more definite beginning and end? Is there going to be an outro? Is there going to be an ending? How do you structure the extra outro, ending, any section so that it serves the overall purpose that you've designed for your album? So these are things that you have to consider. And then what did we write for references? Oh yeah, so we talked about this stuff for references. We use sheet music. Other people don't necessarily use sheet music. That's fine. If you work with guests, try to know what the guests are comfortable with so that you can match their preferences too.
Yeah, which brings us to the next step. So I mentioned earlier again that these processes aren't like linear. So I'll start arranging stuff, and then before every arrangement is done, or Daniel will start arranging stuff, whoever's arranging. And hopefully if we're planning things right, people are recording stuff while some other arrangements are being worked on, and then so there's a nice like overlapping cycle of things going on, and it's not all super condensed one step to the next. But like how do we handle that? So especially when working with other people, we've gotten a good process figured out of getting our recordings to work. Again, we're a remote ensemble. Everybody lives in a different part, so they're recording their parts in isolation, and then we mix that together after the fact, which is not an uncommon setup, I think, among a lot of VGM cover artists, but is novel for a lot of other people. And so how do we do this? We write sheet music if that's what's needed in a certain way, but I don't want to necessarily get into the details of that right now. But more importantly, we send a MIDI file out to all of our collaborators that they just drop into their DAW, and it lines up with their sheet music, and it gives them the tempos and the time signatures. If it's in a musician who doesn't read music, then that MIDI file probably also contains their part, so they can listen to it or look at the MIDI, whatever helps them know what to play.
Right. If they don't read sheet music, then chances are what they're able to listen to is really, really important. So try to get that to sound like what you want that to sound like. Or if you want to give that musician a bit more freedom to create their own part, then just make sure you communicate that.
Yeah, so I always give them a MIDI file for sure, and then an audio mock-up, which I actually don't think needs to sound great, because I would just talk to the person and say, here's what we want. Or usually I'm reaching out to a certain collaborator because we want them to sound like themselves. So
yeah.
They might have, have said, do what you would normally do during this if you were in charge. And then an audio click track. So the idea is they have these 3 files that they can drop into their session in Cubase or Logic or whatever they record in. And all of these things should line up perfectly. So the biggest groups we've had, I think, have been about 16 people. So, like, all those people are referencing the same point when they record, so that they're recording together. Yeah. That's
Yep.
That's the recording process.
One other pro tip is when we give people stuff to record, all of our tracks start on measure 3. We have 2 bars count off, so that's useful for the musicians, not only so that they get a sense of tempo, but also if you try to record and it starts at beat 1, then your beginning might get just chopped off, cut off. So starting on bar 3 prevents that from happening.
Yeah, the sync is a big thing, and I think that's what I've noticed when I've gotten recordings from less experienced recording musicians, or when they're doing it for the first time, is they're not sure where to start their file or whatever. So everybody's got 2 bars of count off, and that's even in the sheet music. If you're using that, bar 3 is the first bar of music, so all that references and is lined up. And then I get files that are starting from the very beginning. So there's 2 empty bars, and there's no like weird clipping at the start because they started like a quarter of a beat too soon, and that got cut off in the recording. But everything if they did it right, I drag the files in, and it's all lined up.
It should be good to go
from the start. Not perfect. It needs to be mixed and
edited,
and wrong notes fixed and stuff. But that part is taken care of, which takes us to mixing. Yeah. Again, these processes are overlapping. So arranging is happening while recording is happening. Maybe not necessarily mixing, because I've been in charge of that too. So if I have to do both, then one's got to happen later. But they're tiered. Again, with us usually having some deadline so that we're actually making progress on this thing and not just sort of putting it off indefinitely. Some mix standards. I always ask for WAV files recorded at a 24-bit bit rate and 48K sample rate. Any higher, it just takes up too much hard drive space, and lower is just slightly less fidelity for you to work with. Even if it's going to go to a CD where it's going to be lower, it's nicer to have better files to start with, to edit, as you'll have more freedom in, not freedom's not the right word, but they'll be able to be manipulated better without like audio distortion and stuff like that. Again, since we're a remote ensemble, we're dealing with special drawbacks of that system. People are in different spaces. We have to make that all cohesive. What I often do in my process is I'll get these recorded files from people. I will put them into a spectral editor, like Isotope RX. There's other ones out there. I think Adobe Audition is one too. and like remove weird sounds or room tone or stuff that's kind of in there, like do noise removal. I mean, our setups are good, so they should sound like professional recordings, but you're still dealing with 5 different spaces, and so there's some editing we want to do to make them as sterile as possible. Maybe this is a good word. And then the dirty secret is everybody is pitch and time edited to some degree, because again, it's remote ensembles. Even if everybody plays perfect, people in the same room played together a different way than people playing to a click track, because they can actually hear each other and phrase things a certain way. So that is, to me, is an essential part of the process, is melodyning folks so that our timing and pitch is all on the same level that it would be if we were actually playing live. And then we have kind of a iterative feedback process. I'll do a mix, share it with everybody. They'll give some comments, and then go back and forth a bit until we have something we're happy with. I want to go back to the idea of just why I like these albums is that you do a lot of work and you're not spending too much time pining over every detail, and that actually leads you to practicing this. So, like, our first albums,
Snowtopia.
I have a program that tracks how much time I spend in everything on my computer. And like Snowtopia was some hundreds, some odd hours in Cubase mixing. And then Brassylvania, which had 30 more minutes of music and more tracks, was like half the time mixing. So there's like obvious improvement in the process just from doing all of that. But if you spend a bunch of time on one track, I don't think you're getting as much practice. Same thing with arranging. I mean, saying done is better than perfect is like an aphorism you've probably heard, but it is very true to just go on to the next thing at some point.
What I've always enjoyed about these sort of things is as long as you're creating, your previous creations are the practice for the next creation. It's very different from practicing and performing for an instrument. Oftentimes, people will spend hundreds of hours in a practice room, and then when it gets to the big show, the big performance, they get one chance to get it right, and that's it for the concert, you know? But what's really nice about doing things creatively like this is that you are producing an output, you are producing something that people can consume and enjoy and appreciate, that you can yourself consume, enjoy, and appreciate and learn from, and that is the practice, that is the warm-up for the thing that you are about to create next.
Yeah. Eventually we have a set of final mixes somewhere, some number of months down the line. In terms of timeline, maybe I want to mention that I think our first album took about 4 months to make.
That sounds about right, yeah.
Which isn't slow, which is pretty fast. But, and then Brassylvania maybe took 6-ish or so. And we've, like, to avoid getting burned out, have intentionally stretched the timelines, because those first 2 were pretty intensive. And
yeah.
I think, like, with Snowtopia, I didn't have much else to do in life at the time.
Yeah.
So it was easy to dedicate the time. But, like,
Brass Effect took us about a year, though there are other reasons for that, too.
But the point is that to just share that this process from starting talking about, not just talking about the album, we talk about albums like 2 years out or 3 years out, the process of actually like planning and being serious about it and picking tracks out, to arranging and mixing and then finally releasing it, is probably anywhere from 4 to 9 months on average. Mm-hmm. And I want to say that just to set like a expectation of what I think other people can do too. If you lay out the deadlines and just go through and get and get things done.
Right. Your mileage may vary. It depends on the size and scope of the ensemble, and it can, in some cases, depend on your experience level. But if you're just starting out, especially, and you really want to just like get a concept out the ground, get it out the door, having a tighter timeline and having a deadline set process. We really like deadlines because we've mentioned it a couple times. We're going to mention it on the slide later. It can really be useful. Shall we go on?
Yeah, and then finally there is a mastering process that I can't really talk about because a different member of our band, Robbie, always does that for us. But again, that's like done after the mixes are done and maybe usually 2 weeks before we plan to submit.
The goal of mastering is to make it sound like all the tracks belong on the same album together. So there are different technical things that we do to make that possible. So
we've arranged, we've recorded and mixed. after planning. But during this whole time, someone has to keep everybody else on task. Then that's unfortunately been my job.
Unfortunately.
To be the bad cop. So the Game Brass is like 6 core members, but most of our albums involve a bunch of other people. And so regular communication is essential to keep the train on the tracks and to make sure everybody knows what's going on and not get confused. We use Slack to talk amongst ourselves, the core members, but otherwise we have like a Discord server for extra collaborators and such. We usually communicate through email. I don't know if that's actually true.
We often reach out through email.
We've reached out through Facebook Messenger and Twitter and whatever we needed to. But I think the important thing there was trying to get people into one place. I guess the initial reach out might be through one venue, and otherwise I'll email them and then say, can we please just communicate through this place now? Preferably Discord, just because I can talk faster there, but otherwise email. So the more organized you are, the happier your collaborators will be. I'm happy to say that most people have told me that this stuff is more organized than other stuff they've worked on. We have a Dropbox for our process is one thing, variation obviously, but we have a Dropbox folder with every track in its own folder, and we throw all the files in there. Here's all your recording reference stuff, the MIDI file, the audio track, and the parts. So you can send them one link, and it's all there in an easy spot. Then we use a separate link for actual uploads. Dropbox has like a file request system where you can just send them a link and they can upload a file for you. Change the process if you're using Google Drive or whatever. The point is having things in a nice central location that is consistent, making sure the file names are consistent and the file types helps out a lot to avoid any amount of confusion along the way.
Making sure people know what part they're playing. Oftentimes the parts are labeled in the title with instrument X person's actual name, so there's no ambiguity about any step of the process.
Yeah, these are the details that are easy to forget, but then cause all sorts of headaches a month down the line when you finally look at the file someone recorded and go, oh, I know you recorded this 4 weeks ago, but you did the wrong part. Sorry, can you do it again? So setting reasonable deadlines. I don't really know what's reasonable, honestly, but I think we usually try to give at least, if we're doing one random track, we try to give at least 2 weeks for someone to record something. For reference, that's 5 minutes or less of music. Albums is a little different. We've usually tried to have a 4 to 8 week range of getting a full album recorded. Yeah. Maybe more. It's a matter of being flexible, and again, the more you do it, the more you kind of get a feel for it. It's going to be different from instrument to instrument. Our stuff isn't necessarily going to take as long to record because you've got 16 parts, and that means everybody's not playing the whole time, or their parts aren't necessarily super difficult. If you're a solo act, then that's obviously going to be a lot more work on one person.
Yeah. I'll say as well, if we have deadlines for other people to hit, usually we communicate what those are, and we ask if that person, if this would be possible for this time, initially when we ask them to get on board. So it's hey, would you be available to play an alto sax part and record this sometime within the next 3 weeks? We don't need video at that time. That's usually what our reaching out looks like.
Yeah. Well, I guess one thing I do want to say about setting deadlines is to not counterintuitively don't plan too much time, because if you give someone 2 months to do something, they'll actually wait 2 months minus 1 day to start it.
Yeah.
And
they'll forget about it.
Don't be afraid to be I need this in 2 weeks, and if they're oh, I need an extra week, then great. I think a shorter deadline adds just enough urgency to make sure they don't just file it away as something they'll do one day that you have to keep following up on. But speaking of following up, so a lot of us have social anxiety and email anxiety. You'll write a message and stare at the send button for 2 hours before you send it. I understand that and completely like that. The only way I've solved it is by just hitting send and then drinking or something to get over it. So
water.
But as I've done it more, it's become more comfortable and been clear that most people don't mind being communicated to frequently as long as you're nice, which isn't that hard to do. You probably are nice in your communication. And the more frequently you're communicating, the more like connection you'll have to the person. If they only hear from you once a month, they're not thinking about you and you're not thinking about them. So like I will send reminders out every week to people at least, and then as the deadline approaches, a little more frequently. Like a reminder every 3 days is not a problem as long as it's just that one reminder. You have the essential information there they need, and you say, please give me a confirmation. I like to ask for confirmation because then I'm justified to ping them again and say, hey, you didn't confirm. I need to know what's going on. This is the thing. I think we're more in our head about being disliked than being on time. So don't be afraid to just keep following up with increased frequency as the deadline approaches. If
it comes to that.
And it's fine. 'Cause the other person also knows they have to do something, and they might not be as organized as you. So reminding them helps them feel better. Like, oh yeah, I have that thing to do.
Yeah. Okay, we should move on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah,
More
this
about organization.
this is relatively similar. So we have a central document that has all the information that we need for each track. We use this. This is really helpful to have when it comes time to think about the track's release and ultimate distribution. So with that, we keep track of metadata, have the title, arranger, original composer, ISRC, which is a number relevant for storefront distribution purposes, the track duration, a rev split for each of the collaborators. We make sure that they get their due there. Oh, we even describe what an IRC is. Nice.
Yeah.
Collaborator information, we take down their information for revenue splits, what they would like to be credited as. It's often useful to ask the person what they would like to be credited as because the answer might surprise you. Just don't forget to credit. Also, don't forget to credit your album artists and any other folks who help produce and market it. No contribution is too small to mention. We're gonna talk a little bit more about that later. But on the next slide,
I was just going to say, this is all in the form of a spreadsheet. We have like a Google Sheet document.
Yeah.
Several tabs for each, one for each album.
Yeah. So the next slide shows a little bit about what that looks like on our end.
Oh, yeah.
So up in the top, you can see we have a little Google Sheet. It has the track name, how long it is, who did it, what other instruments are involved, what the IRC is, ISRC. And then below that, we have an example of revenue splits. The Game Brass mostly sticks to this relatively consistent thing. We've adjusted the specific numbers up or down depending on how many people are involved or depending on what the scope of the album is. Also, in time. Initially, we didn't have a band fund take, but now we do. So just to get you some sort of ballpark idea about how much should I be offering to each composer, this is to each performer. This is what we do. Other people might have a different process, and that's probably fine too. Yeah, we can move on.
I guess to speak about numbers for a second. As somebody who also hires musicians for other gigs to just record, if you're like in a position where you're not splitting revenue and just paying somebody out of pocket, but you don't know how much is a normal range, a recording musician costs anywhere from like $30 to $150 per minute of music to record. I would say on that, depending on the importance of their part. If it's in an ensemble, expect a lower range because they probably have less work to do. But if you need like a ballpark number, probably an average of $50 a minute on less complex stuff, maybe more. Mileage will vary, but I know some people are like, I don't know how much to pay somebody for this stuff. Hopefully that helps.
Okay.
Oh yeah, and the more stuff. So it's really easy to get caught up in all the music because that's what we know how to do. But there's a ton of other stuff to like organize for an album and to think about at the beginning so you're not rushing to take care of it at the end. Such as album art. Mm-hmm. We've had to rush art and then we just like delay the album to get it done. But just think about it early. We usually contact an artist as soon as we have a solid track list so that we like know what the art's supposed to reference. We have made a folder where we just drop a bunch of like pictures of stuff from the games we're referencing, so they have an idea. and then maybe give them a general idea. We give our artists a decent amount of freedom for the most part, to kind of come up with an idea for us, because that's their job. So I personally like to give them that freedom, because
I think the most important thing with album art is really try to get that process moving as soon as you can. As soon as you have a general concept for the theme that is pretty locked solid, as soon as you have a collection of tracks that you're pretty comfortable with, that's a good time to reach out. Artists do take a bit more time to be able to produce the artwork for you. Usually we try to give several months, if possible, and
and that several months, though, I think I would say they don't need a ton of time. Like, they can get a piece of art done pretty quickly, but like that month is to give us time to say, yes, can you now edit this and that and the other thing? Or we've actually had sometimes multiple like basic samples submitted to us, and then we can pick one, and then they can go in and polish it.
Right. It allows a bit of time for the feedback process to really make sure that you get something you're happy with. I'll also say this step with the album art is actually really important, and people don't necessarily think that, but if people are browsing through albums on Spotify, the first thing that they see, the very first impression about the album, your piece of music, they're not going to hear a single note. They're going to see the art first. They're going to decide whether or not to click on your track based on the artwork that they see. So you really want the artwork to be representative of your goal for the album, how you want your album to be perceived. So I highly recommend thinking about album art pretty much as soon as you are set with those broader creative decisions.
Yeah. Another step that then takes place is maybe picking a track order. I don't have any idea of that at the start. I just arrange in some random order, so we've recently just started sitting down and going, here's all the tracks. Or not recently, we did this from the first album. Here's all the tracks. Let's pick out some orders. We have a couple ideas. I don't know that there's any science behind it, except to just feel the vibes. How does it flow from one to the next? And do you have a nice arc across the whole thing? So an album is a whole experience, I would say. So making sure the whole thing feels like you want to listen through the whole thing, even if audience members are just going to have it on shuffle, whatever. But at least the package is complete if they buy the CD and stick it in their car.
Yeah, I'll say as an example to illustrate with the track order. So Brass Effect was our 7th album. It had a space theme. For that album, we wanted to involve a lot of guest arrangers. The guest arrangers kind of chose the tracks that were their favorite tracks. As a result, a lot of the popular tracks ended up getting left off of the album. So the Game Brass ended up being the ones to arrange some of the more popular tracks. And then we took a look at this and realized that, oh my gosh, we have 25 tracks here. So it became a double album. So with that one, when we were choosing the track order for that, I actually made a little spreadsheet that automatically calculated how long each disc was. You would manually put a break cell, and then it would calculate how long the stuff above the break was, how long the stuff below the break was. When we were talking about order, I wrote down a few descriptive words about what is the overall feel of the arrangement. I think I wrote the word majestic on about half of them, but it helped because then we were able to balance it. It's like, okay, do we want to have 7 majestic tracks in a row, or do we want to mix it up a bit more? Depends on what you want that section of the album to be. Maybe you actually do want 7 majestic tracks in a row. Maybe you want to have some majestic tracks, some energetic tracks, some scary tracks, and have that be a bit more of a contrasting process. So yeah, you can get a bit creative there.
Yeah.
Let's move on. Okay, distribution.
Tiny text type.
All right, we got 10 minutes.
Oh, 10 minutes. Okay. So, speaking of timelines, now it takes about 2 weeks to 2 months for your music to get out on distribution services. And this is for cover licensing, or cover songs. So assuming you're covering a song, the distributor needs to get the license, and that is the process that actually takes a while for streaming services. We personally use SoundDrop to distribute on streaming and other digital places. So yeah, and their process is about 2 weeks long. This is going back to the communication thing. This is also someone you might need to communicate with to make sure that your album doesn't get stuck in like some licensing hole and forgotten about, as we've experienced before. So you like find contact support and find somebody who you can talk to. And again, the more you do this, I want to reiterate just getting stuff done and doing this a lot, because then you form relationships and it's easier to like talk to people at these companies you have to work with.
Yeah. I think we're on Soundrop's like preferred contactor list. So,
yeah, so
thanks a lot,
you can
Soundrop. We love you.
Yeah, eventually you can actually talk to like humans and not like the chatbot to get your album pushed through. We also distribute to Bandcamp, which is is very good, but also be careful because it's a very manual process. You actually have to be more organized and on top of things, especially if you're trying to do revenue splits, because nothing's automatic on Bandcamp except for like their ability to download your music. But it can go up instantly. There's no wait time. So that's nice, and things are going more directly to you. Bandcamp is very nice for us.
Yeah.
It's just you need to be prepared to do a lot of that like work of managing things
Right.
and paying attention to what's going on more, because they're able to, I think, provide that for you by being a little bit more I'm not gonna say bare bones, they have a lot of features, but just like being less automatic overall. Physicals. Oh boy.
Okay, that's another
Speaking
another
of
can of worms.
Planning it in advance. So 30 plus days feels about right. We've used a service called Disc Makers. You can search around. There's a million people that print CDs.
Yeah. Disc Makers is based in Canada.
So they're based here too. I think.
Oh, are they? Okay.
I don't know. They've worked for us, so I don't know. Maybe. And when you're thinking about album art, if you are going to do a physical release, that you are going to need more than just your one square. You actually have to print the back and the inside of the album. There's just more to think about, and the more you have to think about, the more time you're going to need. So I think we sometimes work backwards for our timelines. Like we'll say we want this album out by this point, so we're going to need 2 to 3 weeks of lead time to actually submit the file. So everything needs to be done by this week. So recording needs to be done by this week. So mixing can be done by this week. Like going backwards in time to get the whole process there. And so even if it takes you just a week to get it up on streaming, if it's going to take you also a month to get CDs and you want releases to actually be like at the same time, then
that shifts your release
from there.
priority. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
I think that's that.
Oh, promotion. Okay. All right. So I'll say that this is probably the thing that we in the Game Brass are the weakest at. So if you have any other ideas or advice, then we're open to it. But here are some of the things that we were able to figure out through our experiences. A thing that we've been doing recently is writing out a press release. We actually hire someone to do this now. Shout outs to Gur. It includes what the album is about and who we are as artists. And we have this person make several different lengths of press release. So there's a long one that goes more into detail about, maybe it covers some more individual tracks and it has more information about who we are. There are also shorter blurbs that do the same thing, but in a lighter capacity, don't go into quite as much detail. It's helpful to a news outlet or any source that's interested in covering you to have these different lengths available, because oftentimes the news outlet or the person will just take your press release, maybe change a few words, but more or less say it verbatim for their audience. It helps if you sort of do their work for them so they can basically copy and paste as much as possible. And it feels like kind of cheesy to say. I know there's a bunch of plagiarism things going on right now, but that's just how it is. So you want your press release to be as representative of you yourself and of your album and its goals and ideas as a whole as possible. So yeah, we talk a little bit about that, having different length of bios prepared. Another thing we do is organize download codes from Bandcamp. So Bandcamp has a procedure where they give you a certain number of codes depending on how many tracks you've sold, I believe. It's kind of bizarre.
It's easy enough, though. You press a button and they give you some codes. It's not, the limit's not something you have to really worry about. And we copy them all into a spreadsheet. Have we sent this code to somebody? Yes. Have they actually downloaded it? Because Bandcamp will tell you. And then yes to that. just more organization in your spreadsheet. Learn how to use Excel if you haven't before.
Yeah. So we often send Bandcamp codes to people who are doing podcasts, people who listen to music, so they can have access to it for free. We also send Bandcamp codes to anyone who collaborated with us because we appreciate them for collaborating with us.
In terms of trying to get some promotion, like I've sent out hundreds of emails probably, and you've heard the term that it's a numbers game, and it is. So, send out a lot and don't expect a lot of replies, but you will eventually get a couple, and then that hopefully builds from there.
Yeah.
Don't be discouraged if you send out a bunch and like nobody replies. That's just, the world is not always kind to us, but keep at it.
Yeah, and this is also something where we're going to talk about costs in a minute, but you can put more or less money into promotion and expect to get some sort of return for it. So if you decide to pay for something like ads on Facebook, then you get to see what the effects of those are in real time and try to analyze, is this something you want to spend more or less money in the future? That honestly we don't have too much experience in.
So speaking of costs, the game brass is generally self-sustaining at this point. It makes just enough money to pour into another album.
Yeah.
But if you need a ballpark idea of how this is working out, so licensing, again, you only have to think about that if you're doing permanent downloads through like Bandcamp and actually releasing physicals. If not, then it'll just come out of the streaming revenue, and you don't really have to factor that into your whole total here. Album art, I think we've usually paid between $200 and $400 to the artist for the one panel, and I actually don't know what it is if it's been more panels.
It goes to the upper end of that,
but,
yeah.
But yeah, that's about the general range. Sounddrop's very cheap. They only charge $1 per cover license track. We'll see if that goes on forever, but. I can't. And other services have their own models that I can't speak to, but again, that's kind of information that's easy to look up. So licensing services, if you do have to worry about licensing and you're using another service like Easy Song, they are going to charge for their services, and their current price is $17 per track you want to license, right. And that's on top of the actual license per track. So there's some math in there to get an idea of how that actually works out. Point is, the general end thing for a small album run is probably around $300 in licensing fees up front. And then CD printing,
if you go there,
something to look up. And since most of us are probably working at a small scale up front, it's a little bit more expensive per thing to deal with.
Yeah, for most of the time, I would say 100 CDs is plenty. But if you do decide to order more than 100 CDs, then economies of scale, it becomes cheaper per individual CD. But you also have to spend more on licensing per thing sold, to keep in mind.
I guess for some additional context, we are purely independent. We just do all this ourselves. Like, if you're going to work with a label, great. They will likely cover some of this, and that will change the economics, and maybe you don't have to think about as much. But yeah, for context, these are prices based on us just doing this ourselves, and not having another label or service deal with it.
Okay, I think the next page is questions. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. We got a little bit of time. Yeah, go for it.
So, I just hired a 12-piece band to debut an album live.
Nice.
And I know that part of it being successful is to be just being easy to work with and making it so that, like, logistically their expectations are clear and that it's easy for them to know where to be, when, and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But in addition to that, I know that it's impossible for them to ever be as excited about playing my music as I'm excited about playing the music.
Mm-hmm.
But are there things that I can do as a leader of the group to inspire them on a creative and, like, excited to be here and play stuff level?
Okay, so the question is how to make sure that the performers that you've hired are interested and excited and engaged in your music. I think a lot of that does come down to communication, people are happier when you give them parts that are easier to read and are easy to interpret. Like, oftentimes we don't just like write a tempo indication quarter note equals 80. Sometimes we have some kind of word that characterizes what we want the section
write
to.
that on the parts actually.
Yeah. Well, what we wanted to feel like.
I don't know. I said I do just write a BPM.
Oh, do you? All right.
I don't put those fluffy words up there.
Well, I write fluffy words.
But,
I like fluffy words.
I mean, I also want to know if you're hiring a band. Most musicians do like playing music, and like they're happy to play. So as long as you're not mean to them, they're usually happy to be there. And that kind of goes down to the arrangements too. Like I've thought about this too. That I want the musicians to enjoy what they're playing. So like think of how is every part actually enjoyable, or is your bass part just like holding long notes the whole time and kind of boring? You know, so that will get them excited. Like, yes, they won't be as excited about your music as you, but they will be there to perform, and they're happy. The more organized things are, musicians are pretty jaded about, like, because they get a lot of, like, poorly organized stuff. Like, it's just a common issue, I think, in music. So the more you are organized with that stuff, the better your parts look, the better the communication is. Like, that will just help them feel more excited and interested in general, too.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier on about covers. It sounds like you guys just completely avoid anything that would have to do with, the dirty D derivative licensing.
Yeah, because the line between a cover and a derivative license is so blurry as to be indistinguishable in my opinion. But I'm not a lawyer. You have to if something is a derivative work, it has to be licensed directly from the copyright holder. You have to get in touch with them and get written permission. Cover licensing works automatically. They can't refuse it from you, and there's a whole infrastructure to just get the process done automatically without having to ever speak to the rights holder. So, yes, everything we do is classified as a cover because of that. We have tried to talk to rights holders before, especially when it comes to releasing actual sheet music, because that also just has to be done directly, and it can be done. I want to say smaller creators are more likely to get in touch, but I'm not actually sure that's true after tried to do it once. But and big creators will also respond to. So
right. Our most recent album, it's called The Brass Indie Expo, and we did reach out to pretty much all of the composers of the original tracks through the games, mostly because we wanted to get in touch with them about sheet music, but it was also an opportunity to get to show them what we were able to create using their work as a source material, and that helped develop a relationship and a rapport. So in some cases, we were able to, like for Mark Sparling, for example, we were actually able to get an interview with the composer where we talked about the music for a short hike, and he'd heard our cover, and he talked a little bit about that as well. So, yeah.
I mean, we got a slight tangent there, but derivative work is a different thing. You have to license directly, and I don't really even know what would define what that is, honestly. But
yeah. Sean.
I just want to know, so a lot of my work is collaborative. Like I'm speaking with 5, 10 musicians on the project consistently. At what point for either an album or a single does releasing through Bandcamp even become work?
Okay.
I know that it is the most artist friendly in terms of payouts, but if we're playing the manual track, I think it comes with a lot.
Okay, so the question is with single track or a smaller thing that has a lot of collaborators, at what point does it become even worth it to release on Bandcamp, given that you have to manually track everything? I don't know. It's hard to sort of gauge.
I don't know. I mean, we have 16, 17 person splits on some tracks, and we use Bandcamp. That's why I said learn Excel, because then you can make a spreadsheet and just track it, and we then pay out once a year if you have to do it.
Yeah.
I would say that it is a lot of extra work, though. So if you don't want to be burdened with that, understandably, then that's your warning now.
Yeah.
Which is so nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. For what it's worth, in my experience, Spotify and streaming services tend to work very well for singles. Bandcamp tends to prefer albums, things that are more occasions. It's often a bit more difficult to get a person to go through the hassle of spending $1 on a single track, given that they have to like input their credit card information and go through about 7 confirmation screens in order to get to that point, in order to just like own a single track. It's a lot easier to want to commit to that process if you're getting more out of it. So just something to consider.
Okay.
Okay.
I think we gotta wrap it up. So.
Yeah. Okay, so if there are any other questions, we'll be outside. You can feel free to talk to us and approach us. The QR code that's listed there goes directly to the Game Brass's Discord server. If you join that, we have a creative help channel that you're free to reach out into anytime, and that also has our most accurate get in touch with links that are not email. So yeah, thanks a lot for everyone for coming out, and best of luck with your creative projects.